Jake was having the worst day of his life. His cargo ship was making weird noises. The navigation screen kept flashing red, and he was completely lost in the middle of nowhere. He'd been flying transport runs for 5 years, but nothing like this had ever happened before. The ship's computer kept beeping at him with warnings he didn't understand. All he knew was that he needed to land somewhere, and fast, through the front window. He could see a small planet that looked like it might have breathable air. It wasn't on any of his star maps, but right now he didn't have much choice. The landing was rough. Really rough. Jake's ship bounced twice before finally settling on what looked like a flat area near some kind of industrial complex. Steam was coming from his engines, and several warning lights were still blinking. He grabbed his emergency kit and stepped outside to take a look around. The planet was hot and dusty. The air tasted metallic, and everything had an orange tint to it in the distance. He could see tall metal buildings that looked abandoned. Perfect place to wait while his ship cooled down, and maybe find some spare parts. As Jake walked toward the complex, something felt wrong. The buildings looked old and rusty from the outside, but he could hear machinery running deep inside. There were tracks in the dirt from heavy vehicles, and some of them looked recent. This place wasn't abandoned at all. He almost turned back to his ship, but then he heard something that made his blood run cold. It sounded like crying. Not human crying, but something close to it. The sound was coming from somewhere deep inside the main building. Jake stood there for a long moment, listening. Part of him wanted to get back in his ship and leave as soon as the engines were ready, but that crying sound, someone was in trouble. He couldn't just walk away. The main entrance was sealed, but Jake found a service door that had been left open. Inside, the building was much bigger than it looked from outside. Long corridors stretched in every direction, lit by dim yellow lights. The air was thick and hard to breathe. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the sound of drilling equipment. He followed the corridor deeper into the building, past rooms filled with strange machinery and computer screens showing numbers he didn't recognize. The crying sound was getting louder. It was definitely coming from below. Jake found a staircase that led down to the lower levels. Each floor he passed looked more and more like a prison. There were small rooms with heavy doors, and the walls were covered in scratch marks. The crying was very close now. On the lowest level, Jake found a corridor lined with cells. Most of them were empty, but the crying was coming from the last one. The door was made of thick metal with just a small window. When Jake looked through it, he couldn't believe what he saw. Inside the cell was a girl who definitely wasn't human. Her skin had a pale blue tint, and her hair was almost white. She was thin, way too thin, and there were chains around her wrists. She looked like she was about his age, maybe a little younger. When she looked up at him through the window, her eyes were a color he'd never seen before. They were silver, like moonlight. The girl tried to stand when she saw him, but she was too weak. She fell back against the wall, still looking at him with those strange, beautiful eyes. She whispered something in a language Jake didn't understand, but he could tell she was asking for help. Jake tried the door handle, but it was locked tight. There was some kind of electronic lock that needed a code. He looked around and found an emergency override panel on the wall. It took him a few minutes of messing with the wires, but finally the lock clicked open. The smell that hit him when he opened the door was terrible. The girl had been in that tiny space for who knows how long. She tried to speak again, but her voice was so quiet he could barely hear her. Up close, he could see that she was covered in bruises and cuts. Someone had been hurting her badly, just as Jake was trying to figure out how to get the chains off her wrists. Alarms started going off throughout the building. Red lights began flashing, and he could hear heavy footsteps coming down the stairs. He triggered some kind of security system. The girl's eyes went wide with fear. She grabbed his arm with what little strength she had and shook her head frantically. Even though she couldn't speak his language, Jake understood. Whoever had put her here was coming back, and they wouldn't be happy to find him. Jake worked faster on the chains. There was a release mechanism, but it was designed to be operated from the outside. Finally, they clicked open, and the girl almost collapsed without them holding her up. She was so light when Jake picked her up, too light, like she hadn't been fed properly in months. The footsteps were getting closer. Jake could hear voices shouting in a language he didn't recognize. They sounded angry. Really angry. He carried the girl toward a different staircase he'd seen on his way down, hoping it would lead to another exit. The girl whispered something to him as they climbed the stairs. She was pointing toward a door marked with symbols he couldn't read. When they went through it, Jake found himself in a loading bay with vehicles and equipment. And there, across the bay, was another exit that led directly outside. They almost made it. Jake was carrying the girl toward the exit when the main doors burst open behind them. Several figures in dark uniforms came running in, shouting and pointing weapons at them. Jake didn't stop to get a good look. He just ran as fast as he could while carrying the girl. His ship was only a few hundred yards away, but it felt like miles. The girl was getting heavier in his arms, and he could hear vehicles starting up behind them. They were being chased. Jake's lungs were burning by the time he reached his ship, but somehow he managed to get the door open and get both of them inside. The engines were still warm from the rough landing. Jake strapped the girl into the co-pilot seat and fired up the ship as fast as he could. She was unconscious now, her head falling to one side, through the front window. Jake could see armed vehicles racing toward them across the dusty ground. His ship lifted off just as the first vehicle reached them. Jake pushed the engines harder than he ever had before, climbing straight up into the orange sky. Behind them, he could see more ships taking off from the complex. They were following him. Jake's hands were shaking as he programmed to jump to hyperspace. He'd never been in a real chase before. The girl beside him was barely breathing, and he had no idea who she was or where she came from. All he knew was that someone had been keeping her locked up in that terrible place, and now he was probably in more trouble than he'd ever been in his life. As his ship jumped into hyperspace and the planet disappeared behind them, Jake looked at the unconscious girl in the seat beside him. Her silver eyes were closed, but she was still breathing. Whatever happened next, he'd gotten her out of there. That had to count for something. But as he watched her struggle to breathe in the ship's human atmosphere, Jake realized that rescuing her might have been the easy part. Now he had to figure out how to keep her alive. Jake thought the hard part was over once they escaped into space. He was wrong. Very wrong. The alien girl hadn't woken up since they left the planet, and Jake was starting to panic. She was still breathing, but it was shallow and uneven. Her pale blue skin was getting even paler, and those silver eyes hadn't opened once during the 6 hours they'd been traveling. Jake's ship was designed for carrying cargo, not passengers. He had a small living area with a bed, a tiny kitchen, and a bathroom. That was it. No medical equipment, no fancy life support systems, just basic human stuff for basic human needs. But this girl wasn't human, and Jake was starting to realize just how big a problem that was. He tried everything he could think of. He adjusted the temperature, thinking maybe she was too cold. Then he made it warmer, thinking maybe she was too hot. Nothing worked. If anything, she seemed to be getting worse. Her breathing was becoming more labored, and sometimes she would make these small whimpering sounds that broke his heart. Jake had never felt so helpless in his life. He was just a cargo pilot. He flew stuff from one place to another. He wasn't a doctor or scientist or anyone who knew how to take care of sick aliens. He was in way over his head. On the second day, things got really scary. The girl started having what looked like seizures. Her whole body would tense up and shake for about 30 seconds. Then she'd go completely limp. The first time it happened, Jake thought she was dying. He held her hand and talked to her, even though she couldn't hear him. That's when he noticed something strange. When he touched her, the seizures seemed to be less severe. And when he talked to her in a calm voice, her breathing got a little steadier. It was like she could somehow sense that someone was there with her, taking care of her. Jake started experimenting. He moved her from the small couch where he'd first put her to his own bed. The bed was bigger and more comfortable, and it was right next to the ship's main environmental controls. Maybe he could adjust things better from their diet. It worked, kind of. when Jake fine-tuned the humidity and air pressure from the controls next to his bed. The girl's breathing improved slightly when he dimmed the lights to almost nothing. She seemed to relax more when he played soft music from his personal collection. The seizures became less frequent, but the biggest difference came when Jake stayed close to her. If he sat on the edge of the bed and held her hand, or if he talked to her about random things, she seemed more stable. It was like she needed to know someone was there. Jake started sleeping on the floor next to the bed so he could monitor her. Constantly, his back was killing him, and he was exhausted. But every time he tried to leave the room for more than a few minutes, her condition would get worse. On the third day, she finally opened her eyes. Jake was sitting beside the bed, eating a terrible meal from a food packet when he noticed her silver eyes looking at him. She didn't try to sit up or speak. She just watched him with curiosity and something that might have been gratitude. "Hey there," Jake said softly, trying not to startle her. "How are you feeling?" She didn't answer. Of course, she probably didn't understand a word he was saying. But she kept looking at him, and Jake could swear there was intelligence in those strange eyes. She was really looking at him, studying his face like she was trying to figure him out. Over the next few days, Jake learned more about his unusual passenger. She was definitely not from any species he'd ever heard of. Her skin had that blue tint, but it also seemed to shimmer slightly in certain light. Her hair was white as snow and incredibly soft, and those eyes, they seemed to change color depending on her mood or the lighting. But the strangest thing was how she seemed to react to emotions. When Jake was worried or stressed, she would become more agitated. When he was calm and relaxed, she would be peaceful too. It was like she could somehow feel what he was feeling. Jake started being more careful about his emotions around her. He would take deep breaths and try to stay positive, even when he was scared about her condition, and it seemed to help. The calmer he stayed, the better she got. She still couldn't or wouldn't speak, but she started communicating in other ways. She would point at things she needed, or nod when Jake guessed correctly about something. When she was hungry, she would touch her stomach. When she was thirsty, she would point to the water container. The food situation was tricky. Jake's emergency rations were designed for humans, and he had no idea if they would be safe for her. He started with small amounts of the simplest things he had: plain crackers, basic protein bars, clean water. She could keep these down, but she didn't seem to get much nutrition from them. Jake realized he needed help, but he couldn't exactly call a hospital and ask for advice on alien physiology. He started researching everything he could find on his ship's computer about different species and their needs. Most of it was useless, but he found some general information about atmospheric requirements and basic biology. What worried him most was that she still couldn't leave the bed for more than a few minutes at a time. Whenever Jake tried to help her stand or walk around the small cabin, she would become dizzy and weak. The longest she'd been able to stay upright was about 10 minutes, and that was with Jake supporting her the whole time. His bedroom had become like a hospital room. Jake had moved all the environmental controls within easy reach of the bed. He kept water, food, and basic medical supplies on the small table beside it. He'd even rigged up a way to monitor her breathing and heart rate using his ship's sensors. The girl seemed to understand that Jake was trying to help her, and she was trying to help too. She would squeeze his hand when she was feeling better, or shake her head if something he was doing made her uncomfortable. They were developing their own simple language of gestures and expressions. But Jake knew this couldn't go on forever. His ship wasn't designed for long-term medical care, and he was running low on supplies. He needed to find someone who could help her properly. The problem was, he had no idea where to look. Every planet he knew of would probably want to study her, or worse, turn her over to the authorities. And Jake was pretty sure the people who'd been keeping her prisoner before were still looking for both of them. He'd seen ships on his scanner a few times over the past week, and he had a feeling they weren't just random travelers. As Jake sat beside his bed on the 7th night, watching the alien girl sleep peacefully for the first time since he found her, he realized his life had completely changed. A week ago, His biggest worry was delivering cargo on time. Now he was responsible for someone's life. Someone who depended on him completely. He didn't know her name, where she came from, or how long it would take for her to recover. All he knew was that she trusted him, and he wasn't going to let her down. Whatever happened next, they were in this together. Looking at her peaceful face in the dim light of his cabin, Jake made a decision. He wasn't going to abandon her or turn her over to anyone else. He was going to figure out how to help her get better, no matter how long it took, even if it meant his small bedroom had become her world, and his bed had become the only place she felt safe. 3 weeks had passed since Jake rescued the alien girl, and their strange living situation was becoming more normal every day. She was getting stronger, able to sit up for longer periods and even walk around the small cabin for a few minutes at a time. But there was still one big problem. She absolutely refused to sleep anywhere except Jake's bed. Jake had tried everything. He made a comfortable sleeping area in the cargo hold with blankets and pillows. He'd adjusted the environmental controls and other parts of the ship to match his bedroom exactly. He'd even offered to trade places, suggesting he could sleep in the bed while she took the couch. Nothing worked. The moment he tried to move her somewhere else for the night, she would panic. Her breathing would become rapid and shallow. Those silver eyes would fill with terror, and she would grab onto his arm so tightly it left marks. The few times Jake had insisted, thinking it might be good for her to get used to other spaces, she'd had such severe panic attacks that her physical condition actually got worse. It was clear that his bed wasn't just comfortable for her. It was the only place she felt truly safe during the day. She was getting more curious about the ship and about Jake. She would watch him as he worked, tilting her head when he talked to the computer or fixed small problems with the equipment. Sometimes she would try to help, though she didn't understand human technology at all. Jake had started teaching her simple words in his language. Water was the first word she learned to say, though it sounded different in her soft, musical voice. Then food and thank you and Jake. Hearing her say his name for the first time had been one of the best moments of his life. In return, she was trying to teach him words in her language. Her people had a name that sounded like a 3 when Jake tried to pronounce it. She pointed to herself and said what he thought was her name, but it was so complex and musical that he couldn't even begin to repeat it. So he started calling her Luna because of her silver eyes and pale appearance. She seemed to like the name. Luna was incredibly gentle and kind. She would touch injured spots on Jake's hands where he cut himself on ship repairs, and somehow they would feel better afterward. She had a way of sensing his moods that was almost supernatural. When Jake was frustrated or worried, she would sit beside him and just be calm until he felt better too. But Jake was learning that her empathic abilities were both a gift and a curse. Luna felt everything more intensely than humans did. When she was happy, she practically glowed. When she was sad or scared, it was like watching someone drown in emotion. The trauma of her captivity ran deep, and Jake was beginning to understand just how much she'd been through. One evening, while Luna was resting and Jake was checking his navigation systems, she started talking in her own language. At first he thought she was just practicing words or maybe talking in her sleep. But then he realized she was telling him a story. Jake didn't understand the words, but he could hear the emotion in her voice. She would point to herself, then make gestures that looked like she was working or helping someone. Then her voice would become sad and frightened, and she would make motions like things were falling or breaking. She was telling him about her life before the capture. When she started crying, Jake sat beside her and held her hand. She continued talking through her tears, and Jake began to understand that she'd had a family, a home, a purpose that was taken away from her. The people who'd enslaved her hadn't just stolen her freedom. They destroyed her entire world. Luna showed him scars on her arms that Jake hadn't noticed before. They weren't from physical abuse, but from some kind of device that had been attached to her. When she saw Jake's confused expression, she tried to explain by touching her forehead and then pointing to various objects around the room, as if she could sense things about them. Jake realized that her captors had used her natural empathic abilities to find valuable materials or detect danger. They turned her gift into a tool for their own profit. No wonder she was so traumatized. They hadn't just imprisoned her body, they'd violated her mind and spirit. The more Jake learned about what Luna had been through, the more protective he felt toward her. But it also made him realize how much danger they were both in. If her abilities were that valuable to criminals, there would be others looking for her, and they wouldn't give up easily. His concerns proved right when his ship's scanner detected another vessel following them at a distance. Jake had been changing course randomly for days, but the ship stayed with them. It was definitely tracking them somehow. Jake tried to lose them by jumping to different systems, but the pursuing ship always found them again within a few hours. It was faster and more advanced than his cargo hauler. Eventually, they were going to catch up. Luna seemed to sense Jake's growing anxiety. She became more clingy, staying close to him even during the day. She would watch the scanner displays with worried eyes, as if she understood what they meant. Sometimes Jake would catch her staring out the small porthole with a look of deep sadness, like she was saying goodbye to something. The situation came to a head when Jake's ship started having mechanical problems. The constant jumping between systems and running the engines at maximum power was taking its toll. Warning lights were appearing on his control panel, and some of his systems were beginning to fail. Jake realized he was going to have to stop somewhere for repairs, but that would make them sitting ducks for whoever was chasing them. He started looking for places where they might be able to hide while he fixed the ship. That's when Luna did something completely unexpected. She got up from the bed, walked over to Jake's navigation console, and pointed to a specific star system on the display. When Jake looked confused, she tapped the screen more insistently and said what sounded like words in her own language. Jake checked the system she was pointing to. It was way off the normal trade routes, orbiting a dim red star. According to his computer, there were several planets there, but none of them were supposed to be inhabited. It seemed like a perfect place to hide. But when Jake started setting course for the system, Luna became agitated. She kept talking rapidly in her language and touching Jake's arm. She wasn't just suggesting they go there. She was trying to tell him something important about that place. Jake wished desperately that he could understand her better. Was she warning him about danger there? Or was she saying it was safe? Did she know something about that system that his computer didn't? As they approached the Red Star system, with their pursuers still following in the distance, Jake had to make a decision. Trust Luna's judgment about a place he'd never heard of, or keep running until his ship fell apart. Looking at Luna's earnest face and those silver eyes that had never lied to him, Jake made his choice. Whatever was in that distant system, they were going to face it together. But first, he had to make sure Luna was secure in the one place she felt safe. As Jake prepared for what might be a dangerous journey to an unknown world, he realized that his bedroom had become more than just Luna's refuge. It had become the center of both their worlds, the one constant in a universe that seemed determined to tear them apart. And Jake was beginning to understand that keeping Luna safe might mean accepting that some things had changed forever. His bed wasn't just his anymore. His ship wasn't just his anymore. His life wasn't just his anymore. And, surprisingly, Jake found that he was okay with that. The Red Star system Luna had pointed to turned out to be full of surprises. As Jake's ship approached the third planet, his scanners detected something his computer said shouldn't exist. A massive space station hidden in the shadow of one of the planet's moons. Jake's first instinct was to turn around and run. But Luna grabbed his arm and shook her head. She pointed at the station and said something in her musical language. That sounded almost like relief. Whatever that place was, Luna knew about it, and she wasn't afraid. As they got closer, Jake's communication system crackled to life. A voice spoke in the same language Luna used, and she immediately responded, talking rapidly and gesturing toward Jake. After a few minutes of conversation, Luna turned to Jake and said one of the few words she knew in his language, "Friends." The space station was unlike anything Jake had ever seen. It looked like it had been built from pieces of dozens of different ships and structures, all welded together into something that was functional, but definitely not pretty. There were ships docked all around it, and most of them looked like they'd seen better days. When they docked, Jake was amazed to see that the station was full of people from different species. There were beings that looked similar to Luna, but also others he'd never seen before. Some walked onto legs, some on four, and some seemed to float instead of walking at all. But they all had one thing in common: they looked like refugees. Luna seemed more animated than Jake had seen her since the rescue. She was talking to others of her kind in their musical language, and for the first time, Jake saw her smile, really smile, not just the small, grateful expression she gave him on the ship. She was happy to hear her own language and see familiar faces, but Jake noticed that even here, surrounded by her own people, Luna stayed close to him. When one of the station's residents tried to lead her away to what looked like a medical area, she politely declined and returned to Jake's side. She had found her people, but she wasn't ready to leave him. The station's leader was an older member of Luna's species named Elder Kira. She spoke some of Jake's language, learned from other human refugees who had passed through. When Jake told her the story of how he'd found Luna, Elder Kira's expression became very serious. "You have done a great thing," she told Jake, "but you have also put yourself in great danger. The people who held her are not the kind to give up easily. They will keep looking." Elder Kira explained that the station was a secret sanctuary for people escaping from various criminal organizations. They had some protection here, but it wasn't perfect. The pursuing ship that had been following Jake was probably still out there, waiting for them to leave. Over the next few days, Jake learned more about Luna's people and their amazing abilities. They were natural healers and could sense emotions and even physical pain in others. In their society, people like Luna were considered sacred, chosen to help others find peace and wellness. But their gifts also made them targets. Criminal groups would capture them and force them to use their abilities for illegal purposes, like detecting valuable materials or sensing when someone was lying during business deals. Luna had been kidnapped during a raid on her home world and had been enslaved for over a year. Before Jake found her, Jake also learned that Luna's recovery was far from complete. The trauma she'd experienced had damaged her ability to connect with others of her kind. When she tried to use her empathic abilities with other members of her species, she would become overwhelmed and exhausted. The elder explained that this was common among rescued prisoners. "She has learned to shield herself from pain," Elder Kira told Jake, "but now she cannot fully open herself to healing either. She will need time, and she will need someone she trusts completely." Luna seemed to understand this too. Even though she was surrounded by her own people, she spent most of her time with Jake. During the day, she would socialize with others and learn about what had happened to her world since her capture. But every night, she would return to Jake's ship and sleep in his bed. Jake set up a more permanent sleeping area for himself in the ship's cargo hold, but he stayed close enough that Luna knew he was there. He was starting to understand that their bond went deeper than just gratitude. Luna felt safe with him in a way that she couldn't feel with anyone else. The peaceful time at the station came to an abrupt end when the station's early warning systems detected ships approaching the system. Not just one ship, but several. The criminal organization that had been chasing them had found the station. Elder Kira immediately ordered all ships to prepare for evacuation. The station had defenses, but not enough to fight off a full attack. Everyone needed to scatter to different hiding places. Until the danger passed, Jake ran back to his ship to find Luna already there, gathering the few belongings she'd accumulated. She looked scared but determined when Jake told her they had to leave immediately. She nodded and strapped herself into the co-pilot seat. But as Jake started the engine, something went wrong. The pursuing ships had somehow damaged the station's docking systems remotely. Several ships, including Jake's, were trapped in their docking bays. The exit doors wouldn't open. Luna could sense Jake's growing panic as he tried everything he could think of to free their ship. That's when she did something that amazed everyone watching. She placed her hands on the ship's control panel and closed her silver eyes in concentration. Jake felt a strange tingling sensation, like electricity running through the ship's systems. The lights flickered, and then suddenly the docking bay doors began to open. Luna had somehow used her empathic abilities to connect with the station's computer systems and override the lock, but the effort cost her dearly. As soon as the doors opened, Luna collapsed in her seat, unconscious from the strain. Jake managed to pilot the ship out of the docking bay just as the first enemy ships arrived at the station. The next few hours were the most terrifying of Jake's life. He had to navigate through an asteroid field while enemy ships chased them, all while Luna remained unconscious beside him. Every time he looked at her pale face, he worried that she might not wake up. Jake used every trick he learned in 5 years of piloting to lose their pursuers. He hid behind asteroids, used the gravitational pull of planets to change direction quickly, and even flew through the dangerous radiation belt around one of the system's gas giants. Finally, after what felt like forever, Jake's scanners showed they were alone. The enemy ships had either given up or gotten lost in the maze of asteroids and radiation fields. They were safe, at least for now. Luna woke up as Jake was setting course for another distant system. She was weak and disoriented, but alive. When she saw the concern in Jake's eyes, she reached out and touched his hand, giving him that small, grateful smile he'd come to treasure. "Thank you," she whispered in his language, though Jake wasn't sure if she was thanking him for the rescue or for staying with her. Through everything. As they traveled toward an unknown destination, Jake realized that their relationship had changed. Again, Luna had saved him just as much as he'd saved her. They weren't just survivor and rescuer anymore. They were true partners, depending on each other in ways that went beyond words. But Jake also knew that Luna's heroic effort at the station had probably made her condition worse. She was sleeping more and seemed even more reluctant to leave his bed than before. The one place she felt completely safe had become even more important to her. Looking at Luna as she rested in the seat beside him, Jake made a decision. He wasn't going to keep running from planet to planet, hoping to find somewhere safe. It was time to make a real plan, to find a permanent solution that would give Luna the security and healing she needed, even if it meant changing his entire life to make it happen. 6 months after their escape from the hidden station, Jake and Luna had found something neither of them expected: a real home. It started when Jake made contact with a group of Luna's people, who had established a small colony on the edge of known space. Unlike the refugee station, this was a permanent settlement where survivors of various attacks could rebuild their lives in safety. The colony was beautiful. The planet had purple skies and silver trees that reminded Luna of her original home world. The air was clean and filled with the musical sounds that Luna's people made when they were happy. For the first time since Jake had found her, Luna seemed to truly relax. But integrating back into her own society wasn't as easy as either of them had hoped. Luna's trauma had changed her in ways that made it difficult for her to connect with other members of her species. Their natural empathic abilities, which should have brought comfort and understanding, instead overwhelmed her damaged emotional defenses. Being around too many of her own people for too long left her exhausted and anxious. The colony's healers tried to help, but their traditional methods didn't work for someone who had been through what Luna experienced. Her ability to sense emotions had become both stronger and more chaotic. She could feel everyone's feelings at once, and it was too much for her to handle. Jake watched Luna struggle for weeks, trying to force herself to fit back into a world she'd been torn away from. She would spend days with the healers, working on exercises designed to help her control her abilities. Then she would return to Jake's ship exhausted and frustrated, seeking the quiet safety of his small bedroom. The colony leaders were grateful to Jake for rescuing Luna, but they didn't quite understand why she couldn't simply readjust to life among her own people. Some of them suggested that Jake should leave, thinking that his presence was preventing Luna from fully healing. But Luna had different ideas. When the subject came up during a community meeting that Jake was allowed to attend, Luna stood up and spoke in her musical language for several minutes. Jake couldn't understand the words, but he could hear the passion and determination in her voice. After she finished speaking, the room was quiet for a long time. Finally, Elder Vesh, the colony's leader, translated for Jake. She says that you are not preventing her healing, Elder Vesh explained. She says you are her healing. She says that the trauma taught her to fear the intensity of our empathic connections. But your emotional stability gave her a safe way to reconnect with her abilities. Luna nodded and took Jake's hand, in her careful, accented version of his language. She said, Jake is my anchor. With him, I can be strong enough to help others. That's when Jake understood something important. Luna didn't need to choose between her people and their friendship. She needed both, but in a new way that worked for who she had become. Jake made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He asked the colony leaders if he could stay permanently, not as a temporary guest, but as a real member of their community. I know I'm not one of your people, Jake said during another community meeting, but Luna and I have been through something together that changed both of us. If she's willing to share her gift with your colony, then maybe I can share what I have too. What Jake had was something the colony desperately needed, experience with the outside galaxy. Most of Luna's people had lived peaceful, isolated lives before the attacks that destroyed their worlds. They didn't know how to navigate space politics, trade agreements, or deal with the various species they encountered. Jake proposed creating a new kind of sanctuary, not just a hidden refuge, but a place where rescued people could learn to live safely in the larger galaxy. Luna could train other trauma survivors to manage their empathic abilities, while Jake could teach them practical skills for surviving in space. The proposal was revolutionary. Luna's people had always been peaceful and somewhat isolated. The idea of engaging more actively with other species was both exciting and terrifying to them. But Luna supported the plan enthusiastically. She had learned that her trauma, while painful, had also given her insights that could help others. She understood fear and recovery in ways that traditional healers couldn't. Jake began converting his cargo ship into something entirely new. He expanded the living quarters and added specialized areas where Luna could work with other survivors. His old bedroom became a healing space, designed with all the environmental controls and safety features that Luna needed. The bed where Luna had first felt safe became a template for other healing spaces throughout the colony. Jake worked with the colony's engineers to create rooms that provided the same sense of security and emotional stability that his ship had offered. As the months passed, their partnership grew into something beautiful and unique. Luna developed new healing techniques that combined her empathic abilities with the emotional stability she'd learned from living with Jake. She could help other trauma survivors by providing a bridge between their damaged empathic senses and the wider world. Jake, meanwhile, became the colony's ambassador to the outside galaxy. He negotiated trade agreements, established safe travel routes, and created networks with other refugee communities. His experience as a cargo pilot, combined with his deep understanding of what survivors needed, made him perfect for the role. Their work attracted attention from other colonies and settlements. Soon, they were receiving requests for help from survivors across the galaxy. Jake and Luna began making regular trips to other worlds, always returning to their home base, but sharing their knowledge wherever it was needed. The most rewarding part for both of them was watching other survivors find their own paths to healing. They saw former prisoners learn to trust again, families reunited after being separated by slave raids, and entire communities rebuilt with stronger foundations than before. Luna never completely got over her need for the security of their shared space, even as she grew stronger and more confident. She still preferred to sleep in the familiar environment of what had once been Jake's bedroom. But now it was truly theirs, filled with memories of healing and growth rather than just survival. Jake had given up his old life as a simple cargo pilot, but he gained something far more valuable. He had a purpose that went beyond just making money or traveling from place to place. He was part of something that made the galaxy a little bit safer and kinder. Their relationship remained unique and hard to explain to others. They weren't romantic partners, but they were far more than just friends. They were two people who had saved each other in the deepest possible way and had chosen to build a life together based on that foundation. On quiet evenings, when their work was done and the colony was peaceful around them, Jake and Luna would sit together in their shared space and talk about the future. Luna would describe her dreams of a galaxy where her people could live without fear, while Jake would plan new ways to make those dreams reality. Sometimes Luna would thank Jake for rescuing her, but Jake always reminded her that the rescue had gone both ways. Before finding her, he'd been drifting through life without real purpose or connection. Luna had given him something worth dedicating his life to. We save each other, Jake would tell her, and Luna would smile that brilliant smile that had become one of the best parts of his day. Their small bedroom, once a desperate makeshift hospital, had become the center of a new kind of family, not bound by blood or romance, but by choice, shared experience, and a commitment to helping others find their way home. And in a galaxy that could be cold and dangerous. That was exactly the kind of miracle the universe needed.